Lying flat under the weight of my comforter with a half-finished cup of tea resting on the nightstand beside me, I let my thumb drift across the old photo roll in my phone, not really searching for anything but needing something to pull me away. From the silence of another canceled dinner, another message that read, "Swamped at the office, rain check tonight," which had arrived with a thumbs-up emoji that felt more like punctuation than affection. And just when I thought I'd scrolled too far back to anything that mattered, there it was. A picture I'd forgotten, or maybe hidden from myself, taken a few years ago during a weekend when I was still wearing cut-off jeans and sunscreen, like perfume, and the person next to me in the frame, holding a can of ginger ale and looking off to the side, was him, my husband's younger brother, the one with that tilted half-smile and arms too long for his shirt sleeves. And I don't know what hit me harder, the memory of the moment or the way my own face looked in it. Easy, unguarded, a little sunburned and completely unaware of what would come after. My body stayed still, but something inside of it moved, like a low shift beneath the surface, not urgent but undeniable. And the longer I stared at that old photo, the more I felt my breath slow and a strange warmth settle under the blanket, like memory brushing against skin before I could stop it, not with intention but with instinct, like muscle remembering something my mind wasn't willing to admit. And right before thought could become action, a sound from outside broke the silence. A soft thud followed by the metal clink of keys landing in the ceramic dish by the door, which told me I wasn't alone anymore and brought the moment to an end without conclusion. My husband didn't come upstairs right away, but I heard the familiar sequence of his footsteps as he moved through the house. Coat off, fridge open, shoes, kicked into the hallway corner as always. And when he did call out, it was only to say that the site meeting had been moved to Saturday, and he'd probably have to work through the weekend. And I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because it wouldn't have mattered either way. He kissed my forehead out of habit, not affection, and I let him, not because I wanted to, but because not reacting had become easier than reminding him how it used to feel when we kissed for real. And by the time he fell asleep on his side of the bed with the pillow folded under his arm like a second body, I was already back in my head, back in that image from earlier, back in that version of myself that hadn't yet been silenced by routine or dimmed by being ignored. The next evening should have been quiet, just another Thursday in a row of Thursdays that blurred into each other. But when I heard the second key in the door and the sound of a suitcase being rolled across the entry, tiles, I knew that this wasn't part of the usual rhythm. And sure enough, there he was, my husband's brother, standing in the hallway with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and an apologetic smile tucked beneath a day's worth of stubble as he explained that his apartment lease had fallen through and he'd asked if he could crash with us for a little while until things got sorted. And of course I said yes, because what else was I supposed to say? Later that night, after dinner had come and gone and my husband had gone back to his laptop to chase emails in silence, I was folding laundry when he stepped out of the guest room, with his hoodie half on, and said that the heat wasn't working in there, that the vent was blowing nothing but air, and could he borrow a blanket until the landlord came to check it out? So I grabbed the soft gray one from the upstairs closet and carried it down the hall, knocking once before pushing open the door. And that's when I saw him, standing there shirtless with his headphones in, swaying lightly to a beat I couldn't hear. And for a moment we both just froze, not because anything had happened, but because something might have. And it was that possibility that hung between us longer than it should have. He looked at me, not with surprise, but with something slower, something measured, like he was trying to figure out if I was the same woman from the photo he probably didn't even know I'd seen. And I felt heat rise in the back of my neck, not from embarrassment, but from being noticed in a way I hadn't been in far too long. So I handed him the blanket, mumbled something forgettable, and walked away before I could start saying things I'd regret. Hours passed, and the house fell into its usual stillness until sometime after 3 when I woke up thirsty and went downstairs for water, the kitchen light casting just enough glow to catch the shape of him already there, standing barefoot near the sink with a glass in his hand and his hair slightly flattened on one side like he'd been tossing in his sleep. And we didn't say much, just nodded and reached for separate glasses, though I could feel the air shift when I stepped beside him and heard his voice low and quiet as he said, "You've changed. But not with him." And I didn't reply. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I did. That morning, I didn't open the blinds in the bedroom like I usually did because I wasn't in the mood to be seen by anything that wasn't necessary, and instead I moved through the kitchen with slow steps, collecting dishes from the night before and letting the water run too long before using it, just for the sound, just for the weight of something moving in the house other than thought. And when I heard him come in behind me with his usual too loud footsteps and that rhythm that didn't match the quiet of early hours, I didn't turn. I just listened as he poured cereal and sat down without saying good morning, which somehow felt more natural than pretending everything was as it should be. We moved around each other that day without effort, without questions, and I told myself that nothing had changed even though I felt the difference in the space between us. The way his eyes didn't flinch when they stayed on me longer than they should. The way I kept catching myself checking my reflection before walking into a room he might be in, as if I was trying to meet a version of myself he might remember, but my husband had long since forgotten. It wasn't until late afternoon that I heard music again, not through the speakers, but faint through his headphones as I passed the guest room to drop off fresh towels. And for a moment I paused, not at the door but just before it, listening not to the music itself, but to the fact that he was there, behind that thin wood panel with no awareness of me standing only inches away. And I thought about knocking but didn't because I didn't need a reason to open the door and didn't want to invent one. That evening, my husband texted to say he'd be working late again, a last-minute meeting that he swore he didn't see coming. And I didn't reply because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in all the canceled plans and half-hearted I'll make it up to yous that never came with dates or details. So I set the table for 2 instead of 3 and opened a bottle of wine that had been sitting unopened since his last birthday. I didn't expect him to come down when he did, the brother I mean, dressed in a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, asking if I needed help with anything. And I said no, even though I did, because help was a complicated thing and I didn't trust myself to name what it was I wanted help with. So we ate quietly, side by side, like strangers trying to remember where they'd seen each other before but knowing better than to say it out loud. When the plates were rinsed and the kitchen was clean, I stood at the sink drying my hands while he leaned against the counter beside me, drinking from his glass like the room wasn't too small for 2 people, and the silence wasn't too loaded to be called peaceful. And at some point, I realized he wasn't drinking anymore, just holding the glass and watching the way I moved as if waiting for some invisible cue that hadn't been given yet. And when I turned to look at him, he didn't look away. The moment stretched longer than it should have, but not long enough to feel artificial. And though no one moved, everything shifted in those seconds. The air thickening not with tension, but with recognition, the quiet kind that doesn't need words, only acknowledgement. And I felt my heart thudding harder than the moment warranted, because it wasn't about what was happening. It was about what wasn't being stopped. He said nothing, and neither did I. But something passed between us that didn't need translation, something that had been circling us for days in small glances and long pauses, and unspoken what-ifs that had never quite reached the surface until now. And I told myself I should move, say something neutral, change the subject, anything. But I didn't. Not because I didn't know better, but because I knew exactly what I was doing and let it happen anyway. That night, I climbed into bed beside a man who still thought I was his, who still called me babe in text messages and signed his name with a heart when he forwarded bills, but who hadn't really looked at me in months, maybe years. And as I lay still on my side of the bed with the blanket tucked under my chin and the ceiling spinning slowly above me, I realized the part of me that used to feel grateful to be loved had grown quiet, replaced by a part that had only one question left. What if I deserved to be seen again? And when I closed my eyes, it wasn't his face I pictured. That Saturday, morning began the way most of them had since he moved in, with the hum of our old coffee maker bubbling louder than it needed to, and the smell of burnt toast settling into the air like it belonged there. And I was still standing on the second step of the hallway ladder, trying to reach a box of old placemats tucked too high on the pantry shelf, when I heard him behind me, asking if I wanted help. And before I could answer, he was already beside me, steadying the ladder with one hand while reaching easily over my head with the other like it was nothing, like I hadn't been stretching my whole body just to get halfway there. He handed me the box without saying much, but as I stepped down, I caught his eyes holding on to mine for just a second longer than necessary, and I noticed it wasn't the Kind of look someone gives when they're just being helpful. It was slower, heavier, like he was looking at a person and not a sister-in-law. And as I walked past him toward the kitchen, he said something I didn't expect, something so ordinary. It should have disappeared instantly, except it didn't. He said he liked how I had my hair pulled back that day, that it made me look younger, lighter, and I didn't respond right away because I wasn't used to hearing things like that anymore, not even from the man who used to say them all the time before life got too crowded with bills and calendars and frozen meals eaten in silence. That afternoon, I found myself spraying a touch of perfume at the base of my neck before making lunch, not because anyone was coming over, and not because I had anywhere to go, but because I remembered what it felt like to enjoy my own scent, to move through a room and feel like maybe someone noticed. And when I passed by the mirror near the stairs, I smoothed the side of my dress without thinking. And it took me longer than it should have to realize I had picked the dress on purpose, not because it was comfortable, but because it had shape. And I hadn't worn anything like that around the house in a long time. Later, while my husband was packing up his briefcase and muttering about a site visit that would probably run into dinner, I caught myself waiting near the hallway window, not looking outside exactly, but standing in that space between rooms like I had nowhere else to be. And I knew it was because part of me was counting the seconds until I heard the front door click shut and the car back out of the driveway, because only then would I let myself settle into the day the way I wanted to. Slower, softer, maybe even barefoot. I didn't have to wait long before I heard the door close and his car pull away, and within minutes the quiet filled every room like permission, and I was halfway through rearranging the pantry when he walked in with a half-empty mug and said, without looking up from the floor, that I really should walk around without shoes more often because it suited the way I moved. And I almost laughed at how ridiculous the comment was. But instead I just smiled to myself, not because I agreed, but because no one had talked to me like that in years. Not teasing exactly, just present. A few days later, while folding laundry, upstairs with the window open, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the neighbor's patio door across the yard. And I realized he had just stepped into the backyard with the garden hose, probably to rinse off his shoes like he'd mentioned earlier, and for a split second I wondered if he could see into the window from where he was standing. Not clearly, but just enough to catch the curve of my shoulder as I pulled my shirt down over my head. And when I met my own eyes in the mirror afterward, I felt something I didn't expect. Not shame, but a strange quiet inside me, like a question without a name. And though I reached for the curtain, I didn't pull it all the way closed. That Friday, when my husband called to say he wouldn't be home for dinner, again, I asked if he needed me to pick anything up from the store while I was out, and he said no, like always. And I ended the call with the same polite tone I'd used with customer service earlier that week, then grabbed my keys and asked if the brother wanted to come with me since we were both low on groceries. And he shrugged like he didn't mind, tossing his jacket over his shoulder with that same casual ease that made everything feel less serious than it actually was. We didn't talk much in the car, just the kind of silence that doesn't need to be broken. And by the time we walked into the store and grabbed a cart, it already felt like something familiar, like a rhythm we didn't have to build. And while I read labels and compared prices, he took the cart from my hands and steered it beside me without asking, not ahead of me or behind, just close enough that I could feel the space shift each time we turned a corner together. And when we paused in front of the bakery section, I heard a woman behind us whisper to her friend and say something like, "Cute couple." Not loud enough for him to hear, but clear enough for me. And I didn't correct her because I didn't have to. As we waited at the register, he disappeared for a moment without explanation, and came back holding a small coffee cup, the kind with a cardboard sleeve and extra foam on top, and he handed it to me like it was nothing, saying only that the line was short at the cafe inside, and I looked like I could use a pick-me-up. And I thanked him with a glance that probably lasted a beat too long, and when I took the first sip, it wasn't just warm. It was personal. And I turned away not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't want him to see how easily I smiled at something so small. Back home, I placed the bags on the counter and began putting things away slowly, letting each item take its time before finding a place on the shelf, as if the quiet between the two of us needed to be stretched as far as it could go before something gave. And he leaned against the fridge, sipping from a bottle of water, watching me move without speaking, like he didn't want to break the stillness that had started to settle over the room like a soft coat of dust. I could feel his eyes following the curve of my shoulders when I reached up, Not in a way that made me flinch, but in a way that made my pulse slow just slightly, like it was aware of being watched not in fear but in wonder. And I turned toward him with a carton of eggs in my hand and said something about the weather. I think just to ground myself again, just to be reminded that the ordinary still existed and hadn't been entirely erased by the way he stood there with one hip against the counter, like he had nothing else in the world waiting on him. Later, that evening, I changed out of the dress I had worn to the store and slipped into something more casual, but before I pulled the sweater over my head, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and stopped for a second, not to adjust my clothes or smooth my hair, but to study the look in my own eyes. A look that wasn't tired, not tonight. A look that had returned without invitation, and carried the kind of restlessness that used to live in me when I was younger and still believed there was more to being alive than laundry and leftovers. I didn't hear him come upstairs, but I knew he had, the way you can feel someone in the air even before they speak. And when I opened the bathroom door to head back down, he was standing in the hallway, arms folded across his chest like he'd been waiting to ask something he hadn't quite figured out how to say, but instead of speaking, he just smiled slightly and stepped aside, letting me pass close enough to smell the soap on his skin and the faint trace of cologne he must have borrowed from the guest shelf in the hall closet. Downstairs, I poured myself another glass of water and sat at the table with the lights dimmed. Low, not reading, not scrolling, just sitting. And after a while, he joined me, pulling out the chair across from mine and resting his arms on the table like it was natural, like it wasn't unusual for two people to share a silence that thick without needing to fill it. And after a while, he leaned forward slightly and said, "You know, I've never met anyone who carries themselves like you do." And I didn't ask what he meant because I knew, and he didn't explain because he didn't have to. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm, but because something inside me didn't want to miss the first few minutes of light. And as I moved through the kitchen in a soft t-shirt and bare feet, I realized how different the floor felt under my skin when no one else was around to question it. How much more honest the quiet felt when I wasn't trying to fill it with effort. And when he walked in still stretching from sleep with his hair pressed flat on one side and his shirt wrinkled from the night, he blinked at me for a moment and said, "I don't think I've ever seen you this relaxed." And I laughed, but I didn't deny it. By the time my husband came home that night, I had already changed back into something more practical, something neutral. And I was setting the table for 3 again, even though we both knew it would be just the 2 of us once more. And when he walked through the door with the same exhausted smile and the same tap on the back as always, I kissed his cheek and asked about his day, not because I wanted to hear the answer, but because the ritual still mattered to him. And maybe part of me still needed to pretend it mattered to me too. When I went to bed that night, the window was cracked open just enough to let in the breeze, and as I lay down, I thought about the way he had looked at me that morning in the kitchen. Not like he was imagining something, but like he was remembering it from before it had even happened. And I let myself fall asleep without guilt, without apology, and with the quiet certainty that something had started, even if I wasn't ready to admit what it was becoming. The box was heavier than I thought it would be, and the tape I was using kept peeling in crooked strips that didn't stick to anything except my hands and the edge of the kitchen table, and I was standing there holding the end of the roll with my thumb pressed hard against the cardboard, trying not to let the flaps come loose again, when he stepped in behind me and asked if I needed a second pair of hands. And I nodded without turning around because I didn't trust my voice to come out steady, not after the last few days and not after the way the house had been filled with so much space that even closing the fridge door felt like making noise. In a church. He held the box down while I fed the tape across. But the roll snagged again, and the end split unevenly, fraying at the sides like it had decided to unravel itself just to test me, and I sighed and handed him the drawer knife I'd been using as a quick fix for everything that wasn't working, and he took it carefully, slowly, brushing his hand against mine in the handoff. Not fast, not urgent, just enough to feel the full press of skin against skin, before pulling the blade down the tape in one smooth line that didn't make a sound, but felt louder than anything else in the room. I didn't pull my hand back. He noticed. We didn't speak. He touched my shoulder later that evening when I reached into the high cabinet for the dinner plates and nearly dropped one, not because I was clumsy, but because I had lost track of where I was for a moment. And his hand landed softly just under the curve of my neck. Not possessive, not casual. just there, anchoring me in a second I hadn't realized was drifting, and I froze without meaning to, not out of fear but out of the kind of stillness that happens when your body remembers something before your mind agrees it's allowed. And then he let go like it had never happened, but my skin stayed warm long after his hand was gone. My husband texted to say the freeway was a mess and he'd probably missed dinner, and I replied with a simple, okay, because I didn't want to give away the relief blooming too obviously behind my eyes, and I turned the stove down and brought 2 plates to the table instead of 3, telling myself it was just practical. Not symbolic, just a way to prevent leftovers, not an invitation. We ate slowly, the kind of slow that isn't about savoring food, but about drawing out a moment before it ends, and I washed the dishes while he cleared the table, and at some point, I heard him behind me again, not speaking, not moving, just present, and when I looked over my shoulder, he was standing by the doorway with his hands in his pockets and that same stillness in his eyes that he'd had the first night I handed him the blanket, like he saw more than he should, and wasn't afraid of what it meant. The music came from the speaker on the counter, low and accidental. Maybe queued up from the playlist I'd started the week before when I thought I was just trying to bring life back into the house through sound, and it was something soft with strings and the slow kind of rhythm that makes you forget what year it is, and neither of us reached to turn it off. Not because we liked it, but because it gave the silence permission to exist between us without needing to be named. He stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the edge of his presence near my back, and I didn't move forward, didn't break the spell, didn't protect the distance, and when I turned around, our faces weren't close yet, but they were on their way, and something about the air between us felt like waiting, like gravity had stopped caring about right or wrong and had started pulling based only on direction. The kiss didn't rush. It didn't ask. It arrived quietly, like a secret that already knew it would be kept, and when his lips touched mine, it wasn't with hunger, but with something more dangerous. Patience. I didn't push him away. When I pulled back, it wasn't because I regretted what had happened, and it wasn't because I had finally remembered the weight of the ring on my left hand, or the sound of my husband's voice echoing through the years we'd spent trying to keep a quiet life together intact. It was because the silence that followed the kiss wasn't filled with shame or apology, but with a tension so sharp and bright it felt like breathing would slice it open. And I couldn't bear the thought of being the one to speak first and prove that what had just passed between us was real enough to name. I turned away quickly, faster than I meant to, almost stumbling as I moved toward the staircase with my heart pounding louder than my steps and my breath catching in the back of my throat like a hiccup that refused to break free. And I climbed the stairs without looking back because I knew, if I saw his face again, if I saw even a flicker of hesitation or certainty or softness in his expression, I might stop moving altogether. And I needed to move because stillness had suddenly become unbearable. In the bathroom, I gripped the edge of the sink with both hands, pressing down hard enough to turn my knuckles pale as I stared at my reflection in the mirror above the faucet. Not studying my face for answers, but searching for any version of myself that might look like someone who understood what she had just done and why she hadn't stopped it. And I saw the faint tremble in my lower lip and the quick, shallow way. My chest kept rising and falling even though I wasn't crying, and I felt the sting of heat behind my eyes, but blinked it away without letting it reach the surface because tears would make it too dramatic. And this hadn't been dramatic. It had been deliberate and soft and terrifying in its gentleness. Turned on the faucet and let the water run over my wrists until the cold settled into my skin deeply enough to distract me from the noise in my head. And I stood there in that fluorescent light with my sleeves rolled up and my lips still tingling with the trace of something I hadn't prepared for, but couldn't deny had happened. And I told myself that nothing had truly happened, that it had just been a moment, an accident, a lapse in judgment between two people caught in a moment of misplaced connection. But that voice was weak and hollow and unconvincing, because the truth sat heavier than all of that and refused to be reasoned away. I dried my hands slowly, more for the rhythm than the need, and I walked down the hall to my bedroom where the air still smelled like fabric softener and unopened windows, and I sat on the edge of the bed again, not because I wanted to sleep, but because I couldn't yet imagine what I was supposed to do next. And for a long time, I just sat there staring at the darkened hallway, waiting for the house to exhale something, anything. That might tell me this was a night like any other, and not the one that would rearrange the structure of everything I thought I could keep under control. But I didn't sleep, and I didn't undress. And I didn't lie down. I just waited. And when the clock read 2:17 and the light under the guest room door was still on, I stood up without knowing why, and walked quietly down the hall with bare feet and silent steps. And I paused for a full minute outside his room with 1,000 half-formed words racing through my mind, none of them adequate and all of them too honest, and in the end I didn't knock and I didn't speak. I only bent down and slid a small folded piece of paper under the door, a paper I had written in the kitchen with a shaking hand and my heart thudding like a warning, and on it were only 3 words that I hadn't expected to write and couldn't take back. I don't regret. I walked away without listening for movement inside the room, and I didn't look back as I closed the door behind me and slipped back into my side of the bed like nothing had happened. But something had happened, and the air around me was different now. Not because of guilt or fear, but because for the first time in years I had allowed myself to feel something I hadn't dared to ask for, and I wasn't ready to apologize for, wanting it. My husband, who had always moved through the house like the center of a rhythm no one else was allowed to break, had started noticing something too. Not in the way he spoke, but in the way he watched. Quieter than before and longer than he used to, as if trying to remember where I'd gone and whether I was planning to come back. And he asked fewer questions at first, then none at all. And sometimes he stood in the kitchen with a cup in his hand, watching me dry dishes like he was waiting for me to hum or sigh or say anything at all. But I never did, because the silence felt safer than honesty. He mentioned once that I'd started smiling when I was alone in a room, said it like a compliment, but didn't smile when he said it, and when I laughed softly in return, more from nerves than amusement, he only nodded and looked away. And I wanted to ask what he was thinking, but didn't, because if he had answered honestly, I might have had to lie. That evening, his mother came over for dinner, a visit she had postponed twice, and then confirmed last minute. Arriving with a bottle of white wine and a pie she said she'd made herself, though the plastic container tucked inside the paper bag said otherwise, and I had dressed with more intention than usual, not for her, but for the presence of everyone else, choosing a soft blue dress I hadn't worn in over a year, something that fit too well to be comfortable but just right to be remembered. The table was already set when she arrived, and the food was warm, and I was halfway through telling her about a neighbor who'd finally cut down the massive tree in their yard, when he, her younger son, the one whose presence made each room feel like it had a second temperature, leaned back slightly in his chair and said he liked the color of my dress, that it made my eyes look lighter, and he said it like it was a fact, not a compliment, but it landed in the air between us with the weight of something noticed, and his mother looked at him first, then at me, and though she said nothing, her silence curled at the edges like paper too close to flame. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and she was upstairs washing her hands in the guest bath, I went to the bedroom to change, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to wear that dress in front of her anymore, and I closed the door most of the way, not all the way, just enough to keep out the hallway but still feel the pull of the air behind it. And I stood in front of the mirror unzipping the side slowly, the kind of slow that comes when you're not dressing for speed but for memory. And when I stepped out of it, I paused for a moment, adjusting the neckline of my slip absent-mindedly, the way you do when you forget that someone might be watching, though I knew I wasn't. I saw his reflection before I heard his footsteps, a stillness just beyond the doorframe, and I didn't turn around. Not immediately, because I needed to. Know what I would do if he didn't leave? And when our eyes met in the mirror, his from the shadowed hallway and mine from the dim yellow light above the dresser, I stopped moving completely, not out of fear but out of recognition, because there was something quiet and unbreakable in the way he didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't lower his eyes. I raised one hand slowly and touched the edge of the door, not to close it, but to let it shift just enough to suggest that I saw him, that I knew, that I hadn't mistaken his presence for anything accidental. And then I pulled it slightly inward, narrowing the view but not severing it, and I let it stay that way, not because I wanted him to come in, but because I didn't want him to leave either. I didn't hear his steps retreat down the hall, and I didn't hear the door close behind him, which meant he stayed there, somewhere on the other side of the half-drawn line I had left between us, and I stood in front of the mirror, not touching my hair, not adjusting the fabric on my shoulder, just standing, as if stillness could make the moment less dangerous, as if pausing in place might rewind something I already knew couldn't be undone. And though I never looked directly at the door again, I knew without question that he hadn't moved, that he was still there, breathing softly, not invading, not waiting, simply existing in the same stretch of air that now felt so much heavier than it had seconds before. Eventually, I reached for the sweater I had laid across the foot of the bed and slipped it on slowly, not because I needed the warmth, but because I needed something between me and the heat rising up the back of my neck. And when I finally did close the door fully, I did it gently. Not as an act of rejection, but as a signal that the moment had passed. Not erased, not denied, only acknowledged in silence, and then put aside before it became a decision. Downstairs, the house had settled into that late evening quiet that always followed dinners with guests. The kind where every sound feels sharper than it should be, like the clink of a glass against the counter or the muted thump of a cabinet door, and his mother was sitting on the couch flipping slowly through a magazine she wasn't reading, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the staircase like she was counting how long I was gone, and my husband sat in the armchair with his phone in one hand and the TV remote in the other, not watching, not listening, just present enough to pretend. When I walked into the room, he glanced up and offered me a faint smile that didn't touch his eyes, and I sat beside him with the kind of careful ease you use when the air has grown too thick for real conversation, and I could feel the heat still, lingering on my skin, not from shame but from the way attention, once returned, never quite fades quietly. I said little for the rest of the night, not because I didn't want to speak, but because I was afraid of what might come out if I did, and I busied myself with cleaning the kitchen, wiping down counters that didn't need wiping, organizing drawers I hadn't touched in weeks, and when I turned to reach for the sponge near the sink, I caught his eyes from across the room, not my husband's, but his brother's, and though he said nothing, the look he gave me wasn't uncertain or questioning, it was steady and knowing, and it told me that he had understood what the half-closed door had meant. Later, after his mother had said her goodnights and gone to sleep in the guest room with her alarm clock set for some early errand she had made a point to mention 3 times over dinner, I returned to our bedroom and stood in the doorway for several minutes before walking in, and my husband was already lying on his side, reading something on his tablet, his expression blank and his body as still as it always was when the weight of silence felt safer than asking what was wrong. I changed into my night clothes without turning on the overhead light, moving slowly, not because I was hiding, but because fast motions felt too loud, and when I slid into bed beside him, he shifted slightly, enough to acknowledge my presence without bridging the space between us, and I stared at the ceiling with my hands folded over my stomach, breathing evenly, pretending to sleep long before I actually did. In the darkness, with the window cracked and the faint hum of the neighbor's wind chimes drifting in on the breeze, I let my mind replay the exact angle of his shoulders in the doorway, the way his head had tilted slightly as if to say he wasn't surprised. And I wondered whether he had stayed there because he thought I wanted him to, or because he couldn't make himself leave. And I knew deep down that the answer to both was probably yes. That night I didn't dream, but I didn't rest, either, and when I finally sat up around 3 and looked out the window at the stillness of the street, I felt the strange ache of something that hadn't yet happened but had already begun to change me. And I didn't cry or shake or whisper his name into the dark. I just sat there with my knees drawn up and my arms wrapped around them like a woman who had already made a choice without saying it out loud. I didn't hear the car pull into the driveway, and I didn't hear the lock turn or the door open, because we were both sitting on the living room floor with our backs against the couch and our legs stretched out in opposite directions, still catching our breath from the light routine he had shown me earlier. Something quick and easy to help my shoulders stop aching after weeks of stiffness. Or at least that's how it started. But the exercises had ended 10 minutes ago, and now we were just there, close enough that our arms occasionally touched as we adjusted how we sat, and close enough that I had stopped thinking of the floor as a neutral space and had started thinking of it as a place I didn't want to leave just yet. He made a quiet joke about how terrible I was at balance, and I laughed, maybe louder than I meant to, and leaned into the edge of the couch with our arms touched as we adjusted, and neither of us moved away. Like the space between us had shifted from casual to something more aware, as if he wasn't asking, only noticing. Not in a way that demanded anything, but in a way that made it clear we were no longer pretending. And I didn't move. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I did. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said, and every moment we had spent building up to this one without naming it. And when I turned to look at him, not slowly, not fast, just as if it was the only thing I could do with my body in that moment, I saw that his face was calm and waiting and completely open, and the pause that followed wasn't hesitation, it was permission. And then we kissed. Not like we had lost control, but like we had found it. And I don't know how long it lasted, or whether the room shifted, or whether the air changed, but I remember how soft everything felt, and how quiet the world had gone. What I didn't know was that at that exact second, my husband was standing inside the entryway with the front door still open behind him and a folder tucked under one arm from the meeting that had been abruptly rescheduled. And instead of going back to the office as planned, he had decided to stop home to change, thinking the house would be as he left it, quiet and predictable and safe. He heard the faint rhythm of the floor creaking under weight and maybe a breath or a laugh, or something too low to be words. And instead of calling out, he walked toward the sound with the casual ease of someone who doesn't expect the world to shift under their feet in the next 5 seconds. And when he reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner to the living room, he stopped moving altogether. I didn't see him first, not until the moment already existed, not until we had finished the kiss, our faces too close to ignore, and his hand still where it had landed moments ago, not shifting, not apologizing, with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to ask. And when I did see him, standing there with his mouth half open and his keys still in one hand like he hadn't figured out yet whether to drop them or grip them tighter, I froze completely, not out of guilt, not yet, but out of the kind of dread that feels like a second skin, and I watched as his face went through the full cycle of disbelief into clarity without even blinking. His voice, when it finally came, didn't rise at first. It broke. Not like a question, but like a verdict. And he looked at me with a fury so clean it made the air around him feel thinner. And he said the words like they had been waiting for years inside his chest, like they had finally found the moment they were meant for. And when he shouted, "Are you serious? In my house?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't have words, but because there weren't any that would matter. He didn't wait for explanations or let the silence stretch long enough to cool the heat in his voice. He just stepped forward, like he couldn't help himself, and looked at me like he was trying to understand whether the woman standing in front of him was the same one he'd built a life with, or whether I'd been someone else all along. And then he turned his face, slightly as if the sight of us had physically pushed him back. And when he spoke again, his voice cracked through the air like something tearing in two, and he said, "You had all of me, every part, every piece, and this is what you traded it for. Your hand on his leg in my house like none of it ever mattered." I opened my mouth to respond, but my body wouldn't follow, like my throat had closed up in defense of something I didn't know how to protect, and I took a step forward out of instinct, not because I thought it would change anything, but because I couldn't stand still and carry the weight of what I had just allowed to happen while the man I once promised everything to stood in the doorway, watching it burn without even trying to stop it. Next to me, his brother, the one who used to be the person I smiled at across dinner tables and laughed with in kitchens without consequence, had already stepped back with his hands lowered like he was preparing for impact. Not physically, but emotionally. And when my husband turned to him with that same fire still alive in his voice, he didn't yell. He didn't move fast. He just stared at him like he didn't recognize a single part of his own blood anymore. And when he spoke, the words were sharper than anything he could have thrown. And he said, "You don't even open your mouth. Not a word, not a sound, because whatever you think you are, you're not even a man. Not after this. Not after standing there like she belonged to you." I didn't look at his brother. Not at first, because whatever we had been moments ago was now buried under the weight of what had been seen and said, and I walked past him like the room no longer contained oxygen, climbed the stairs like each one belonged to someone else, and shut the door to the bedroom that still smelled like him and still held the shape of a life I had cracked apart with a kiss and a silence and a stillness that I had refused to break when I had the chance. That night I didn't sleep in the bed, and I didn't undress. And I didn't lie down. I just sat on the floor with my back against the closet door and my eyes staring at nothing until the room faded into a version of itself that I no longer recognized, and I kept hearing his voice. Not the words, but the sound of them. the way they had torn through the space between us like they had always been waiting, and I knew there was no taking any of it back. Not the moment, not the hand, not the kiss, and certainly not the photo. I had chosen something, maybe not out loud and maybe not fully, but clearly enough that someone who loved me had seen it and named it and left because of it. And now the silence that followed wasn't peaceful or soft, or holding space for anything good. It was the kind that filled rooms with consequences, the kind that made even your own breathing feel like a reminder that you could have done it differently and chose not to. Newt morning, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like absence, not the kind that lingers gently, but the kind that empties out the room so thoroughly that even the walls forget what they were holding. And I knew something was wrong before I opened my eyes, because there was no sound of the front door locking, no distant hum of the shower, no soft thud of the drawer he always closed too hard when looking for socks, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for a noise that never came. And when I finally stood up and walked through the house, it didn't feel like I was waking into my life. It felt like stepping into something abandoned. The living room was untouched, pillows still in place, his coffee mug still in the sink from yesterday. But his car was gone and his jacket wasn't on the hook, and I checked my phone expecting a message, a missed call. Even a blank screen would have said more than what I saw. Nothing. Not even the usual email alert from the bank. And when I tried to pay for groceries later that day, the card declined with a soft, impersonal beep that made my hands go cold. And I tried it again, knowing full well it wouldn't work. And when I checked the app, the shared account we'd used for years showed 0. I went home with a knot in my throat and a dull ache growing behind my eyes, and when I opened the mailbox, there was a single envelope, no name, no return address, just sealed white paper that felt heavier than it should. And I stood in the hallway with the door half open and tore it gently along the seam, and inside was a flash drive, unmarked except for a single folder that loaded instantly when I plugged it into my laptop. And inside that folder was only one file, no title, no timestamp, just an image that moved. Not a video in the traditional sense, not with sound or music or edits, but raw footage, maybe 30 seconds long, enough to see my own face leaning in, my eyes closed, my lips on his hand resting where no hand should have been if the room had belonged to someone else. I sat staring at it long after it ended, hitting replay without meaning to, watching it not because I didn't know what was on it, but because I needed to see it through the eyes of the man who had watched it first. And when I closed the laptop, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, not because I had been caught, but because it was no longer just my secret to carry. It had become a file, a thing that could be copied, sent, saved, and it was. Within an hour, it appeared in the family group chat. No caption, no message, just the file dropped in as if it were a link to an article or a birthday invitation. And I stared at my screen, watching the little check marks appear, one by one, next to each name, confirming they had opened it. And I tried to delete it, but I was too slow, and the chat lit up with responses. Some short, some long, most unreadable through the blur of panic tightening around my chest. The first message came from his mother. I hoped you were a person. Turns out I was wrong. No punctuation, no greeting. Just that. Then the exit started. Cousins leaving the group, aunt typing, "Is this real?" One of his friends sending a single emoji that made me close my eyes for a full minute before I could breathe again. I didn't respond. What could I say that wouldn't make it worse? The next morning, still dazed, still in the clothes I'd worn for 2 days, I opened my email and saw the message from my manager, polite in tone and surgical in content, saying that while they understood that what had happened was technically personal, the nature of the exposure and the ease with which it had traveled made it hard for clients to separate private judgment from public confidence. And I was advised to either take an extended unpaid leave or submit a resignation. And I chose the second, not because I agreed, not because I was brave, but because I didn't have the strength to fight a battle I already knew I had lost. That evening, his brother was gone too. I opened the browser on the kitchen computer and found a tab still open. One-way tickets, no return, no note, no explanation, just confirmation and a departure time that had already passed. And I sent him a message before I could stop myself. Nothing dramatic, just 4 words. I'm not okay either. and the bubble turned gray, marked as red, and an hour later my profile photo vanished from his chat list, and I knew what it meant. He had blocked me. Not because of anger. Because someone had made sure he understood what the cost would be if he didn't. He never texted me. He never looked for me. He didn't ask if I needed help moving or where I would go or what I planned to take with me. And I didn't ask either because there was nothing left that could be salvaged from a silence that deep. Nothing that could be reshaped into kindness when everything I had once been in his eyes had already been removed. And every room in the house began to feel like an exhibit of the life I had walked through without realizing the doors were closing behind me one by one. I started packing in silence, taping boxes with clothes I no longer wanted and photos I couldn't bear to leave behind, but didn't have the courage to look at. And I spent long hours sitting on the edge of the bed that used to belong to a marriage. Not crying, not sleeping, just existing in the space where I used to be someone's person. And one night I scrolled through my phone hoping for a message I hadn't seen, a missed call I'd somehow forgotten to notice, but the log was empty. 3 full days without a single incoming. Not even a mistake from a stranger or a promotional text. And I realized I had been erased not just from his life, but from a system that once knew how to reach me. My friends didn't write, not even the ones who used to reply with emojis and exclamation marks at midnight when a recipe failed, or when I wanted to rant about politics, and I saw them still active in the group chats, still tagging each other, still breathing in a rhythm I no longer matched. And when I messaged 2 of them directly, one read and said, "I don't know what to say," and the other never opened it at all, and I stopped after that, because silence feels like punishment only when you expect noise in return. My parents called once, not to scold, not to console, just to say that they heard things, and they weren't getting involved, because I was old enough to understand what my choices meant. And I said I understood. And the call ended with a pause that lasted too long to be an accident and not long enough to be goodbye, and I sat at the kitchen table with the phone still warm in my hand, staring at the floor, wondering whether shame grows slowly or arrives fully grown the moment you realize you can't explain yourself to people who already think they know what happened. Later that night, I opened the laptop I had barely touched since the morning the message from work came through, and I stared at the blank screen for several minutes before typing a single line, not as a confession, not as a letter, but as a marker to remind myself that this had happened, and I wrote, "He didn't yell. He just erased me, and everything. Else the silence took care of." And I didn't type anything else. Because sometimes silence is the only way to explain what no one is asking you to say.